I thought I was throwing myself a simple 55th birthday celebration. What I got instead was a wake-up call that would change everything. My own son looked me dead in the eye and said those words that still echo in my mind. "This is your last good year, Mom." He thought he was being clever, thought he had me figured out. But what he didn't realize was that he had just triggered the most empowering year of my life, and it would indeed be his last year living off my generosity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Morrison, and for 28 years, I believed I was being the perfect mother. I had built what I thought was a beautiful life in Portland, Oregon, working my way up from a junior accountant to the CFO of Cascade Financial Group. My late husband David had passed away when our son Jeremy was just 15, leaving me to navigate both single motherhood and a demanding career. I thought I had done everything right. The house on Maple Ridge Drive was my pride and joy, a stunning craftsman-style home with 4 bedrooms, a finished basement, and a backyard that overlooked the city. I had purchased it 5 years after David's death, determined to give Jeremy stability and comfort despite our loss. Every mortgage payment, every renovation, every carefully chosen piece of furniture was selected with love and the hope that this would be our sanctuary. Jeremy had always been what I generously called artistic. While other kids his age were getting part-time jobs or focusing on college prep, Jeremy spent his days playing guitar, writing what he called meaningful lyrics, and talking about his big break that was always just around the corner. At 28, he still lived in the basement, which I had converted into a beautiful apartment complete with its own entrance, kitchenette, and bathroom. I told myself I was supporting his dreams. His girlfriend Melissa had been living with us for 3 years. She was a soft-spoken girl from a small town outside Eugene who had moved to Portland to find herself. She worked sporadically as a barista or at various retail jobs, but never seemed to hold on to anything for more than a few months. Jeremy insisted she was just between opportunities, and I welcomed her with open arms. After all, she made him happy, and isn't that what mothers want for their children? The warning signs had been there for months, maybe even years, but I had become an expert at explaining them away. When Jeremy's friend Marcus moved into the spare bedroom upstairs temporarily, after losing his apartment, I convinced myself it was just Jeremy being a good friend. When Melissa's sister Brooklyn showed up with her 2 young children claiming she needed a place to stay after her divorce, I opened my doors wider. The house that had once been a peaceful haven for 2 had somehow become a boarding house for 6 adults and 2 children, all looking to me for support. But I rationalized everything. Jeremy was my son, and family helps family. Melissa was practically family too, and her sister was going through a difficult time. Marcus was a good influence on Jeremy, encouraging his music and promising connections in the local scene. I was helping people, I told myself. I was being generous and kind, the way David would have wanted me to be. The financial strain had become increasingly noticeable over the past year. My grocery bills had tripled. The utility bills were astronomical with so many people coming and going. The water heater had to be replaced twice because of the increased usage. My carefully maintained savings account was slowly draining, but every time I mentioned it, Jeremy would get defensive. "Mom, you make good money," he would say, that casual dismissiveness in his voice that I had learned to dread. Besides, we're all contributing in our own ways. I'm working on my music, Melissa helps with cooking, and Marcus does yard work sometimes. The contributions were minimal at best. Jeremy's music career consisted mainly of playing coffee shop open mic nights for tip money that rarely exceeded $20. Melissa's cooking help meant she occasionally made pasta for everyone, using groceries I purchased. Marcus's yard work was sporadic and usually involved him sitting on the porch with a beer, claiming he was planning the landscaping. Brooklyn was perhaps the most brazen of all. She had arrived with nothing but a few suitcases and immediately began treating my home like a free daycare service. Her children, 8-year-old Chloe and 6-year-old Tyler, were sweet kids, but they had never been taught boundaries. They left toys everywhere, tracked mud through the house, and had somehow managed to break my favorite ceramic vase within their first week. When I gently mentioned it to Brooklyn, she shrugged and said, "Kids will be kids. Besides, it's just stuff." Just stuff. The vase had been a wedding gift from David's mother, one of the few mementos I had left of her after she passed. But Brooklyn saw it as just stuff, easily replaceable, not worth worrying about. That attitude seemed to permeate everything in my house now. My carefully curated home, my sanctuary, had become just stuff to people who saw only what it could provide them. The most frustrating part was how Jeremy had changed. The sweet, sensitive boy who used to help me with dinner and ask about my day had been replaced by someone who felt entitled to everything I provided. He no longer asked if friends could come over. He simply announced their arrival. He didn't request help with expenses. He assumed I would cover them. When I tried to have serious conversations about the future, about expectations, about basic respect, he would either deflect with humor or become sullen and withdrawn. "You don't understand the creative process, Mom," became his standard response to any suggestion that he might need to contribute more financially. Real artists can't be tied down by conventional expectations. Besides, you've got everything handled. You always do. That phrase haunted me. You always do. It had become his excuse for never stepping up, never taking responsibility, never growing into the man I had hoped he would become. I always handled everything, so why should he bother? The breaking point should have come months earlier, but I kept pushing it down, making excuses, hoping things would naturally improve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I told myself that Jeremy was still young, still figuring things out. I convinced myself that this was temporary, that eventually everyone would move on, and I would have my house and my peace back. I had become an expert at moving the goalposts, at adjusting my expectations downward to accommodate increasingly unacceptable behavior. My friends at work had started to notice the strain. My assistant Sarah would comment on how tired I looked, how I seemed distracted during important meetings. My closest friend and colleague, Patricia, had stopped by the house unexpectedly one evening and was visibly shocked by the chaos she encountered. Toys scattered across the living room, dishes piled in the sink, Marcus passed out on my expensive sofa with beer cans littering the coffee table, and the unmistakable smell of marijuana drifting from the basement. "Linda," Patricia had said carefully, "this doesn't look like your home anymore." She was right, of course. The house that had once been my pride and joy, the sanctuary I had worked so hard to create, had become unrecognizable. The hardwood floors were scuffed and stained. The walls needed repainting from all the dings and marks. The furniture I had carefully selected was showing wear from people who didn't care for it the way I did. But admitting that would mean admitting that I had failed, that my generosity had been taken advantage of, that my own son was using me. Instead, I made more excuses. "Everyone's just going through a rough patch," I told Patricia. "Family helps family." But late at night, when the house was finally quiet and I was alone in my bedroom, I would lie awake calculating expenses, worrying about my retirement savings, and wondering when my life had stopped being my own. I would think about David and wonder what he would say about this situation. Would he be proud of how I had supported Jeremy, or would he be disappointed in how I had allowed myself to be taken advantage of? The answer scared me, because deep down I knew David would never have tolerated this level of disrespect in his home. He had been kind and generous, but he had also believed in personal responsibility and mutual respect. He would have had difficult conversations that I kept avoiding. He would have set boundaries that I kept moving. As my 55th birthday approached, I found myself both dreading and anticipating it. Part of me hoped that Jeremy might use the occasion to show some appreciation, maybe take the initiative to plan something special, or at least acknowledge everything I had done for him and his extended household. Another part of me feared that it would just be another day where my needs and feelings were overlooked in favor of everyone else's convenience. I decided to take control and plan my own celebration. I made reservations at Celestial, an upscale restaurant downtown that had been on my list for months. I bought myself a new dress, a beautiful navy blue number that made me feel confident and elegant. I arranged for a car service so I could enjoy wine without worrying about driving. For once, I was going to celebrate myself properly. When I announced the dinner plans, Jeremy's reaction was immediate and predictable. "That place is really expensive, Mom. Are you sure you want to spend that much money? I mean, we could just order pizza and watch a movie." The suggestion that my birthday celebration should be about saving money, about settling for less, about accommodating everyone else's preferences instead of my own, should have been the final straw. But I had become so conditioned to putting everyone else's needs first that I actually considered it for a moment. "It's my birthday," I said finally, with more firmness than I usually managed. "I want to go somewhere special." Jeremy shrugged, with that casual indifference that had become his signature response to anything that didn't directly benefit him. "Okay, but don't expect us to dress up fancy or anything. We're not really those kinds of people." Those kinds of people. As if wanting to celebrate properly, wanting to feel special on my birthday, wanting to enjoy the fruits of my own labor, made me somehow pretentious or unreasonable. As if the woman who had supported him and his friends for years, who had provided them with a beautiful home and endless financial support, wasn't worthy of a nice dinner on her birthday. But I held my ground. The reservation was made, the dress was hanging in my closet, and for once, I was going to do something purely for myself. I didn't know it then, but that decision would set in motion a series of events that would fundamentally change my life and force me to confront truths I had been avoiding for far too long. The morning of my birthday started like any other day. I woke up early, made coffee for everyone, and prepared breakfast while the house slowly came to life around me. Brooklyn's children were particularly energetic, running through the hallways and shrieking with delight as they played some complicated game that involved jumping off furniture. The noise was overwhelming, but when I gently asked them to play more quietly, Brooklyn shot me a look that clearly communicated her annoyance. "They're just being kids, Linda. It's not like you're trying to sleep or anything." The dismissiveness in her tone, the way she used my first name instead of showing any respect for the fact that this was my home, my birthday, and my desire for a peaceful morning, was jarring. But I had become so accustomed to swallowing my frustration that I simply nodded and retreated to my bedroom to get ready for work. At the office, my colleagues made a point of acknowledging my birthday. There were flowers on my desk, a beautiful cake in the break room, and heartfelt cards from people who appreciated my work and leadership. For a few hours, I felt valued and respected. My assistant Sarah had organized a small celebration during lunch, and several department heads stopped by to wish me well. It was a stark contrast to the indifference I had experienced at home. "You seem different today," Patricia observed as we shared cake in my office. "Happier, more like yourself." I realized she was right. Away from the chaos and demands of my house, away from the constant feeling that I needed to manage everyone else's needs and problems, I felt like Linda Morrison, successful CFO, respected colleague, accomplished woman. At home, I felt like an ATM with legs, valued only for what I could provide. The realization was uncomfortable, but I pushed it aside. Tonight was about celebration, about acknowledging another year of life and hopefully creating some positive memories with my family. I left work early to get ready, taking extra time, with my hair and makeup, savoring the quiet of my bedroom before the evening began. When I emerged from my room in my new dress, feeling confident and beautiful, I expected at least some acknowledgement from the household. Instead, I found Jeremy sprawled on the couch in ripped jeans and a stained t-shirt, playing video games with Marcus. Melissa was in the kitchen wearing sweatpants and an oversized hoodie, and Brooklyn was chasing her children around the living room in yoga pants and flip-flops. "Everyone needs to get ready," I announced. "Our reservation is in an hour." The collective groan that arose from the group was audible. Jeremy paused his game and looked at me with obvious annoyance. "Do we really have to go? Can't we just celebrate here?" "Yes, we really have to go," I said, my voice carrying more steel than usual. "It's my birthday, and this is what I want to do." The getting ready process was excruciating. Jeremy eventually changed into slightly cleaner jeans and a button-down shirt that was wrinkled and too small. Marcus borrowed clothes from Jeremy that fit even worse. Melissa put on a dress that was appropriate, but paired it with sneakers and a denim jacket. Brooklyn managed to find black pants and a blouse, but complained loudly about having to find a babysitter for the children at such short notice. "This is costing me $40 for a sitter," she announced as we waited for the car service. "I hope you know I can't really afford this right now." The implication was clear. I should offer to pay for the babysitter. And because I had been conditioned to solve everyone else's financial problems, I almost did. But something held me back. It was my birthday. I was already paying for dinner at an expensive restaurant for 6 adults. Surely someone else could handle their own childcare costs for one evening. The car ride to the restaurant was tense. Jeremy complained about the traffic. Marcus made inappropriate jokes about the restaurant's name, and Brooklyn spent the entire time on her phone, texting what appeared to be complaints to various friends about having to attend a fancy dinner. Only Melissa seemed to make an effort, commenting on how nice I looked and expressing genuine enthusiasm about trying somewhere new. Celestial was everything I had hoped it would be. The atmosphere was elegant but warm, the service was impeccable, and the food was extraordinary. For the first time in months, I felt sophisticated and valued. The maitre d' wished me a happy birthday and presented a complimentary champagne toast. Our server was attentive without being intrusive, and the other diners created a pleasant buzz of conversation that made the evening feel special. But my companions were determined to find fault with everything. Jeremy complained that the portions were too small for the price. Marcus made loud comments about how pretentious the menu descriptions were. Brooklyn grumbled about the expense every few minutes, making sure everyone around us could hear her displeasure. Even the champagne toast was met with criticism. "This stuff tastes weird," Marcus announced loudly. "Don't they have beer?" I found myself apologizing to the server, making excuses for behavior that was embarrassing and inappropriate. I was mortified by their conduct, but I also felt trapped. This was supposed to be my special evening, my birthday celebration, and instead I was managing other people's bad behavior and trying to minimize the disruption they were causing. The final straw came during dessert. I had ordered the restaurant's signature chocolate soufflé, something I had been looking forward to all week. When it arrived, beautifully presented with fresh berries and a delicate spun sugar garnish, Jeremy took one look at it and laughed. "Seriously, Mom? They charge $30 for that tiny thing? You could get a whole cake at the grocery store for $10. The comment was made loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. I saw other diners glance over with expressions ranging from sympathy to judgment. The server, clearly uncomfortable, retreated quickly. My face burned with embarrassment. But more than that, I felt the crushing weight of disappointment that had been building all evening. This was my birthday. This was supposed to be my celebration. And instead of feeling joy or gratitude or love, I felt ashamed, embarrassed, and profoundly alone, despite being surrounded by people who were supposed to care about me. But the worst was yet to come. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, Jeremy stood up and raised his water glass in what I initially thought might be a belated birthday toast. The gesture caught everyone's attention, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that he might salvage the evening with some heartfelt words. "A toast to Mom," he began, and I felt myself smile for the first time all evening. 55 years old today. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. The smile that spread across his face wasn't warm or loving. It was calculating, almost cruel. "This is your last good year, Mom," he said, his voice carrying clearly across our table and to the surrounding diners. "Better enjoy it while you can." The words hit me like a physical blow. The restaurant seemed to go quiet around us, though I'm sure the other conversations continued. I felt my face flush hot, then cold, as the meaning of his words sank in. This wasn't a toast to my health or happiness or future. This was a threat disguised as humor, a cruel reminder that in his mind I was declining, becoming less valuable, approaching irrelevance. But what horrified me even more than his words was the reaction of the others. Marcus laughed appreciatively, as if Jeremy had made a particularly clever joke. Brooklyn smirked and nodded, clearly enjoying what she saw as a justified put-down. Even Melissa, who I had thought might have some decency, simply looked uncomfortable but said nothing in my defense. The silence stretched out painfully. I could feel the eyes of other diners on us, could sense their discomfort and pity. The server hovered nearby, clearly uncertain whether to intervene or retreat. My son, my only child, the person I had sacrificed. Everything for had just publicly humiliated me on my birthday, and everyone at the table was either enjoying it or complicit in their silence. I set down my fork carefully, my hands surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. When I spoke, my voice was quiet but clear. "Check, please." The ride home was silent except for occasional snickering from Marcus and Brooklyn. Jeremy seemed pleased with himself, as if he had accomplished something important. I stared out the window at the Portland lights and felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had spent 28 years making excuses for her son's behavior, who had rationalized away his selfishness and disrespect, who had convinced herself that her generosity was helping him grow into a better person, was dying. In her place, something harder and clearer was being born. A woman who could see the truth without the filter of maternal love and desperate hope. A woman who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling their worst impulses. A woman who was done being anyone's stepping stone. Jeremy thought he had delivered a clever insult about my age and diminishing relevance. What he had actually done was issue a declaration of war. He just didn't know it yet. As we pulled into the driveway of my beautiful house, the house that sheltered 6 adults and 2 children who contributed nothing but took everything, I made a decision that would change all our lives. Jeremy was right about one thing. This would indeed be someone's last good year. It just wasn't going to be mine. The next morning arrived with the usual chaos. Brooklyn's children were up before dawn, their feet thundering across the ceiling above my bedroom as they raced through the hallway. The sound of running water told me that someone was already monopolizing the upstairs bathroom, probably taking one of those 40-minute showers that had become routine since my house turned into a commune. The aroma of burned toast drifted up from the kitchen, mixed with the unmistakable smell of marijuana that seemed to permanently cling to the basement ventilation system. But something was different about me. The woman who normally would have jumped out of bed to assess the damage, to clean up whatever mess had been created, to smooth over whatever conflict might be brewing, remained motionless under her covers. I stared at the ceiling and let the sounds wash over me without feeling the familiar spike of anxiety about what needed to be fixed or managed. Jeremy's words from the night before echoed in my mind with crystal clarity. "This is your last good year, Mom. Better enjoy it while you can." The memory didn't bring the sharp pain I had expected. Instead, it brought something that felt almost like relief. The pretense was over. The illusion that this arrangement was somehow temporary, that these people cared about me as anything more than a provider, that my son respected me as a person, rather than viewing me as a resource to be managed, had finally been shattered completely. I remained in bed for another hour, not out of depression or defeat, but out of strategic thinking. For the first time in years, I was planning instead of reacting. Every decision I had made regarding Jeremy and his extended household had been emotional, driven by guilt or hope or maternal instinct. Today, I was going to start thinking like the CFO I had trained myself to be. I was going to analyze this situation with the same cool logic I brought to struggling companies and failed investments. The assessment was damning. Jeremy contributed nothing financially, but consumed housing, utilities, food, and countless other resources that I provided. Melissa worked sporadically, but spent more on personal luxuries than she contributed to household expenses. Marcus paid no rent, bought no groceries, and had somehow managed to run up my electric bill with whatever equipment he was using in the garage for his supposed handyman business. Brooklyn not only contributed nothing, but had brought 2 additional dependents who required food, supervision, and constant cleaning up after. From a purely financial perspective, I was subsidizing 6 adults and 2 children to the tune of approximately $3,000 per month in direct costs, not including the wear and tear on my home, the stress-related health impacts, or the opportunity costs of not being able to enjoy my own space. Any business that operated with this kind of unsustainable overhead would be bankrupt within a year. But the financial calculation, shocking as it wasn't even the most disturbing part of my analysis. The real revelation was about respect and reciprocity. In a healthy household, even one where people needed temporary support, there would be gratitude, consideration, and effort to contribute in whatever ways possible. Instead, I was living with people who had come to view my generosity as an entitlement, my home as their personal hotel, and my feelings as irrelevant to their comfort. Jeremy's birthday toast hadn't been a momentary lapse in judgment or an unfortunate attempt at humor. It had been a clear statement of how he viewed me, as a declining asset, someone whose value was diminishing and whose opinions mattered less with each passing year. The fact that he felt comfortable making such a statement publicly, in front of strangers, revealed just how little regard he had for my dignity or feelings. When I finally emerged from my bedroom, the house was in its typical state of controlled chaos. Dishes from breakfast were piled in the sink, though no one had bothered to load the dishwasher. Coffee grounds were scattered across the counter, and someone had left milk sitting out to spoil. Melissa was in the living room, ostensibly watching Brooklyn's children, but actually absorbed in her phone while the kids jumped on the furniture. Marcus was nowhere to be seen, though his truck was still in the driveway, suggesting he was sleeping off whatever substances he had consumed the night before. Jeremy was at the kitchen table with his laptop, working on what he claimed was a music project, but looked suspiciously like social media browsing. He didn't look up when I entered, didn't acknowledge the previous evening, didn't offer any kind of greeting or recognition. This, I realized, was his way of communicating that he considered the matter closed. He had said his piece, established his dominance, and now expected life to continue as normal. "Morning, Mom," he said eventually, his tone casual and dismissive. "Coffee's cold, by the way. Might want to make a fresh pot." The statement was so perfectly emblematic of our entire relationship that I almost laughed. Not only was he not offering to make fresh coffee himself, despite being perfectly capable and having contributed to the problem by drinking the existing pot, but he was framing it as helpful advice rather than a request. This was how he operated, identifying problems that affected his comfort and presenting them to me as my responsibility to solve. "Actually," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "I think you can handle making coffee yourself this morning." Jeremy's head snapped up from his laptop. In all our years together, through all the gradual expansion of his expectations and erosion of boundaries, I had never refused such a simple request. His expression shifted from surprise to irritation in seconds. "What's your problem?" he asked. It's just coffee. You're right, I agreed. It is just coffee, which is exactly why you can make it yourself. The exchange was minor, almost trivial, but it represented something much larger. For the first time, I was refusing to automatically solve a problem that Jeremy was perfectly capable of addressing himself. I was treating him like the adult he claimed to be, rather than the child I had been enabling him to remain. Jeremy stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to determine whether this was some kind of temporary mood or a more significant shift. When I simply stood there, waiting calmly for him to respond, he finally got up and stomped toward the coffee maker with exaggerated irritation. "Fine," he muttered. "Don't know why you're being so weird about it." But I wasn't being weird. I was being normal. In a healthy relationship between adults, people handle their own basic needs and make reasonable contributions to shared responsibilities. The weird thing was how far I had drifted from normal, how completely I had accepted an arrangement where I was responsible for everyone else's comfort while my own needs were ignored or dismissed. Over the next few days, I began implementing small changes that felt revolutionary in the context of our established patterns. When Melissa mentioned that we were out of her favorite yogurt, I didn't automatically add it to my shopping list. When Marcus complained that his shows weren't recording properly, I didn't offer to call the cable company. When Brooklyn's children left toys scattered throughout the living room, I didn't pick them up. Each individual incident was minor, but collectively they began to create a new dynamic. People who had grown accustomed to having their problems solved by me suddenly found themselves having to take responsibility for their own lives. The reactions were immediate and predictable. "Mom, you're acting really strange lately," Jeremy said after I declined to drive across town to pick up guitar strings for him. "Are you feeling okay?" The question was loaded with implication. By framing my new boundaries as potential illness or emotional instability, he was attempting to pathologize my behavior rather than acknowledge that his expectations might be unreasonable. It was a manipulation tactic I recognized from my professional life, where struggling executives often tried to frame accountability measures as personal attacks rather than necessary corrections. "I'm feeling fine," I replied calmly. "I just think you're old enough to handle your own errands." "But you drive right past that music store on your way home from work," he protested. "It would be so easy for you to just grab them." This was the core of Jeremy's worldview. If something was easy for me to do, then it was unreasonable for me to refuse to do it. My time, my convenience, my preferences were irrelevant compared to his needs. The fact that it would be equally easy for him to drive to the music store himself, or that I might have my own plans for my time after work, simply didn't factor into his calculations. "Easy for me doesn't mean it's my responsibility," I said. "You want guitar strings? You can get guitar strings." The conversation ended with Jeremy storming off to his basement apartment, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. But he did eventually drive himself to the music store, and he did get his guitar strings. The world did not end because I failed to solve his problem for him. Brooklyn's reaction to my new boundaries was more direct and aggressive. When I stopped automatically washing the dishes her children left around the house, she confronted me directly. "Linda, I don't understand what's going on with you lately," she said, positioning herself in my path as I tried to leave for work one morning. "You're acting really selfish." The accusation of selfishness was particularly rich coming from someone who had been living rent-free in my home for months while contributing nothing to household expenses or maintenance. But I recognized it as another manipulation tactic, an attempt to make me feel guilty for not continuing to enable her irresponsible behavior. "I'm not being selfish," I replied evenly. "I'm being realistic about what I can and should be responsible for." "But we're family," Brooklyn protested. "Family helps each other out." This was the argument I had been dreading, the emotional manipulation that I knew would be the hardest to resist. The appeal to family loyalty, the suggestion that setting boundaries was somehow a betrayal of familial love. The implication that my worth as a person was tied to my willingness to sacrifice my own needs for others. But I had spent the last week analyzing this argument with the same logical rigor I brought to financial assessments, and I had reached some uncomfortable conclusions. Real family relationships were characterized by mutual respect, reciprocal support, and consideration for everyone's needs and boundaries. What I had been participating in wasn't family support, it was exploitation disguised as family loyalty. Family does help each other, I agreed. But family also respects each other, contributes what they can, and doesn't take advantage of someone's generosity. This arrangement isn't helping anyone grow or become more independent. It's just creating dependency. Brooklyn's face flushed with anger. So what are you saying? You want us to leave? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications and threats. This was the moment I had been avoiding for months, the confrontation that would force me to choose between maintaining peace and maintaining my dignity. Brooklyn was essentially daring me to enforce consequences, betting that I wouldn't follow through because the emotional cost of seeming mean or unsupportive would be too high. But Jeremy's birthday toast had changed something fundamental in me. The woman who would have backed down, made excuses, found a compromise that allowed everyone else to avoid responsibility while I absorbed all the consequences, was gone. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. I'm saying that everyone in this house needs to start contributing fairly, or find alternative arrangements, I said. Clearly. This isn't sustainable for me financially or emotionally, and it's not healthy for any of you to be completely dependent on someone else's generosity. The conversation escalated quickly from there. Brooklyn accused me of being heartless, of abandoning family, of caring more about money than relationships. She brought up her divorce, her financial struggles, her children's need for stability. Every argument was designed to make me feel guilty for setting reasonable boundaries, to frame my basic need for respect and reciprocity as selfish cruelty. But I held firm. I had spent too many years absorbing other people's problems, making their emergencies my responsibilities, allowing my life to be dictated by their needs and comfort. The cost had been my savings, my peace of mind, my self-respect, and ultimately my relationship with my own son, who had learned to see me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The confrontation ended with Brooklyn calling me names I won't repeat and threatening to tell Jeremy how unreasonable I was being. The threat was supposed to scare me, to make me worry about damaging my relationship with my son. Instead, it clarified something important. If Jeremy sided with Brooklyn over his own mother, if he supported someone who was living in my house rent-free while insulting and threatening me, then our relationship was already more damaged than I had admitted to myself. That evening, Jeremy did indeed approach me about the conversation with Brooklyn. But instead of the reasoned discussion I might have hoped for, he came armed with accusations and demands. "Mom, what the hell is wrong with you?" he began, not even bothering with a greeting. "Brooklyn is crying upstairs because you basically told her she's not welcome here anymore." The framing was typical Jeremy. Brooklyn was the victim, I was the aggressor, and he was the reasonable mediator trying to resolve an unfortunate misunderstanding. The fact that Brooklyn had been living in my house without contributing anything, that she had been disrespectful and demanding, that she had called me names when I set basic boundaries, was irrelevant to his narrative. I told Brooklyn that everyone needs to start contributing fairly, I corrected. If that made her cry, maybe she should examine why the idea of taking responsibility for herself is so upsetting. Jeremy's face darkened. "She's going through a divorce, Mom. She has kids. Where is she supposed to go?" "That's not my problem to solve," I said, and the words felt foreign coming out of my mouth. For so long, everyone else's problems had automatically become my problems. The idea that I could acknowledge someone's difficulties without taking responsibility for fixing them was revolutionary. "Not your problem?" Jeremy's voice rose. "She's family." No, Jeremy, she's your girlfriend's sister. And even if she were my own sister, that wouldn't obligate me to provide unlimited free housing and support while being treated with disrespect in my own home. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Jeremy using every manipulation tactic he had learned over the years. He accused me of being heartless, reminded me of all the times I had helped people in the past, suggested that I was having some kind of mental health crisis, and eventually resorted to threats about moving out and taking everyone with him. That last threat was particularly telling because it revealed how Jeremy saw the situation. In his mind, he and his household were doing me a favor by living in my house. He genuinely believed that threatening to leave would motivate me to back down, return to my previous accommodating behavior, and accept whatever treatment they chose to dish out in exchange for their continued presence. He was genuinely shocked when I responded, "That might be for the best." The silence that followed was profound. Jeremy stared at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. The possibility that I might actually want him to leave, that I might prefer living alone to living with people who treated me badly, had apparently never occurred to him. "You don't mean that," he said finally. "I absolutely mean it," I replied. "Jeremy, I love you. You're my son, and that will never change. But I won't continue to be treated like a servant in my own home. I won't continue to subsidize a lifestyle for people who show me no respect or appreciation. And I definitely won't continue to accept insults and threats when I ask for basic consideration." Jeremy's expression cycled through several emotions: confusion, anger, calculation, and finally what looked like genuine fear. For the first time, he was confronting the possibility that his comfortable arrangement might actually be in jeopardy. The woman who had always backed down, always compromised, always found a way to accommodate everyone else's needs, was holding firm. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally, and there was something almost plaintive in his voice. It was a good question and one I had been thinking about carefully. I had moved beyond the point of trying to repair this arrangement. Too much damage had been done, too many boundaries had been crossed, too much disrespect had been shown. But I was willing to give Jeremy one final opportunity to demonstrate that he understood the gravity of the situation. "I want everyone who doesn't live here legally to find other arrangements within 30 days, I said clearly. "I want anyone who stays to contribute $300 per month toward household expenses. I want common areas kept clean and my personal belongings treated with respect. And I want to be spoken to civilly in my own home." The terms were more than reasonable. $300 per month was far below market rate for a room in Portland, and the other expectations were basic standards that any adult should be able to meet. But Jeremy's reaction made it clear that even these minimal requirements were unacceptable to him. $300? He said incredulously. "Mom, I don't make that kind of money." "Then maybe you need to find ways to make more money," I suggested. "Or find a living situation that better fits your budget." "You're being ridiculous," Jeremy said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone he used when he wanted to manipulate me into changing my position. "This is about that stupid comment I made at dinner, isn't it? I was just joking around. You're taking everything way too seriously." This was Jeremy's standard approach to accountability. Minimize the offense, reframe it as a misunderstanding, and suggest that the real problem was my oversensitivity rather than his inappropriate behavior. It was a tactic that had worked for years, allowing him to avoid genuine apologies or behavior changes by making me question my own reactions. But I had moved beyond the point where this manipulation would work. Jeremy's birthday toast hadn't been an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment. It had been the culmination of years of increasingly disrespectful behavior, the public expression of an attitude that had been growing more obvious over time. "This isn't about one comment," I said firmly. "This is about a pattern of behavior that shows you don't respect me as a person. This is about you treating my home like a free hotel and my resources like they're infinite." This is about you enabling other people to disrespect me in my own house." Jeremy's face was flushing now, the way it had when he was a child and realized he wasn't going to get his way through charm or manipulation. "So what? You're kicking out your own son?" The question was designed to make me feel guilty, to frame reasonable boundaries as maternal rejection. But I had learned to recognize these tactics for what they were: attempts to avoid responsibility by making me responsible for his emotions and choices. "I'm not kicking you out," I said calmly. "I'm giving you a choice. You can meet the same basic standards I would expect from any adult roommate, or you can find a living situation that better suits your preferences. But I won't continue to live like a stranger in my own home." The ultimatum was delivered, and now the ball was in Jeremy's court. Part of me hoped that he would rise to the occasion, that the prospect of actually losing his comfortable arrangement would motivate him to demonstrate the respect and consideration that had been missing for so long. But a larger part of me already knew what his choice would be. Jeremy had spent years learning that he could push boundaries without consequences, that he could take my support for granted, that his comfort was more important than my dignity. Changing that dynamic would require him to acknowledge that his behavior had been wrong, to take responsibility for his actions, and to make genuine efforts to contribute and show respect. Those were reasonable expectations for any adult relationship. But they were revolutionary changes for someone who had been enabled to behave like a spoiled child for nearly 3 decades. And as I watched Jeremy's face cycle through emotions, I realized that he was going to choose comfort over growth, entitlement over responsibility, and his own convenience over our relationship. The conversation ended with Jeremy storming back to his basement apartment, slamming doors and muttering about how unreasonable I was being. Within an hour, I could hear animated conversations happening throughout the house as he shared his version of events with the other residents. The tone was urgent and indignant, the volume deliberately loud enough for me to overhear. I sat in my bedroom, listening to the sounds of a household in crisis, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. For the first time in decades, I wasn't responsible for managing other people's emotions or solving their problems. I had stated my boundaries clearly and calmly, and now the consequences of their choices were theirs to bear. The next few days were tense but revealing. Instead of meeting my reasonable requirements, the household seemed to double down on their previous behavior. Dishes piled higher in the sink, noise levels increased, and I began finding evidence of deliberate disrespect. Cigarette butts on my back porch, food containers left to rot in the living room, and mysterious stains on the bathroom fixtures. It was as if they were testing me, pushing to see if I would back down when faced with escalating problems. The strategy might have worked on the old version of myself, the woman who prioritized peace over principle and would have bent over backward to avoid conflict. But the woman who had endured public humiliation on her birthday, who had finally seen the truth about how these people viewed her, was unmoved by their tantrum. If anything, their behavior was confirming that my assessment had been correct. These were not people who were temporarily struggling and grateful for support. These were people who felt entitled to my resources and resentful of any expectations placed on them in return. A week into my 30-day ultimatum, Jeremy made his position clear. Instead of looking for work or making any effort to meet my requirements, he announced that he had been in contact with his Uncle Ray, my late husband's brother, who lived in Seattle. "Uncle Ray says we can stay with him while we get back on our feet," Jeremy announced during one of our increasingly rare conversations. "He actually cares about family." The implication was obvious. I was the heartless one, the family member who had failed in her obligations, while Uncle Ray was stepping up to provide the support that I was cruelly withdrawing. It was a narrative that painted Jeremy as the victim and me as the villain, which allowed him to avoid any self-reflection about how we had reached this point. "That sounds like a good plan," I said, and Jeremy's confident expression faltered slightly. He had expected me to fight for him, to beg him not to leave, to offer better terms to keep him from following through on his threat. Instead, I was calling his bluff. If Jeremy preferred living with his uncle to meeting basic adult responsibilities in my house, then that was his choice to make. I wasn't going to negotiate with emotional blackmail or compete for the privilege of being taken advantage of. "You really want us to leave?" Jeremy asked, and for the first time in weeks, his voice carried genuine uncertainty rather than righteous indignation. "I want you to be happy," I said honestly. "If living with Uncle Ray will make you happier than contributing fairly to a household here, then you should absolutely do that." Jeremy stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to process this response. The mother he knew would have been devastated by the prospect of him moving away, would have been willing to negotiate endlessly to prevent such an outcome. He was unprepared for a mother who valued her own dignity enough to let him face the consequences of his choices. "Fine," he said finally. "We'll be out by the end of the month." The announcement was made with the air of someone delivering a devastating blow, but it felt more like a reprieve. I would miss my son, but I wouldn't miss the stress, disrespect, and financial drain that had become our normal relationship. And, perhaps with some distance and real-world consequences, Jeremy might eventually learn the lessons about responsibility and respect that I had failed to teach him through enabling. The final weeks were a flurry of packing, planning, and increasingly desperate attempts at manipulation. Brooklyn tried tears, pleading about her children's need for stability. Marcus attempted to negotiate a special deal where he could stay, in exchange for handyman work that he had never actually performed. Melissa, to her credit, seemed genuinely apologetic, and even offered to pay rent if she could stay alone, but I knew that wouldn't be sustainable given her sporadic employment history. Jeremy himself oscillated between anger and last-ditch attempts at reconciliation. He would storm around the house complaining about my unreasonableness, then show up with coffee and apologies, trying to charm his way back into my good graces. The pattern was exhausting and familiar, and I recognized it as the same cycle that had kept me trapped in this dysfunctional arrangement for years. But I held firm. I had learned to distinguish between genuine remorse and strategic manipulation, between real change and temporary adjustments designed to preserve the status quo. Jeremy's apologies were always coupled with excuses, his promises always came with conditions, and his improvements always seemed to disappear once he thought the crisis had passed. 3 days before the deadline, Jeremy made one final attempt to change my mind. He appeared in my bedroom doorway late one evening, looking younger and more vulnerable than he had in years. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I messed up. I know I said some things I shouldn't have said. But this is really how you want things to end between us." It was the closest thing to a genuine apology I had heard from him, and it tugged at my maternal instincts in exactly the way it was designed to do. For a moment, I felt the familiar urge to make everything okay, to find a compromise that would allow us to avoid this painful separation. But then I remembered his birthday toast, delivered with such casual cruelty in front of strangers. I remembered years of increasing entitlement and decreasing respect. I remembered the way he had enabled and participated in the disrespect that others had shown me in my own home. "Jeremy," I said gently, "this isn't how I want things to end between us, but it is how things need to change. You're 28 years old. It's time for you to learn that actions have consequences, that relationships require mutual respect, and that other people's generosity isn't unlimited." "But where does this leave us?" he asked, and there was real pain in his voice. "That depends on you," I replied. "I will always love you. You will always be my son. But I won't continue to enable behavior that's destructive for both of us. If you want a relationship with me going forward, it needs to be based on mutual respect, rather than financial dependency." Jeremy nodded slowly, though I could see he didn't really understand what I meant. He was still thinking in terms of temporary consequences and future reconciliation, not recognizing that I was talking about fundamental changes in how we related to each other. On moving day, the house was chaotic with boxes, tears, and recriminations. Brooklyn left with dramatic pronouncements about family loyalty and promises that I would regret my decision. Marcus departed with barely a word, loading his possessions into a borrowed truck with obvious resentment. Melissa hugged me goodbye and whispered a genuine apology for how things had worked out. Jeremy was the last to leave. He stood in the driveway beside Uncle Ray's truck, looking back at the house that had been his home for most of his adult life. For a moment, I thought he might say something meaningful, might acknowledge the reality of what was happening and his role in bringing it about. Instead, he said, "I hope you're happy, Mom. I hope having an empty house is worth losing your family." The words were designed to hurt, to make me question my decision and feel guilty for choosing my own well-being over his comfort. But they had the opposite effect. They confirmed that Jeremy still saw himself as the victim in this situation, still believed that I was the one who had been unreasonable and cruel. "I love you, Jeremy," I said simply. "I hope Seattle works out well for you." He climbed into the truck without another word, and I watched them drive away without crying. The relief I felt was overwhelming and immediate. The house was quiet. For the first time in years. There were no demands for my attention, no problems for me to solve, no one treating my space and resources as if they were communal property. I walked through the rooms slowly, assessing the damage and planning repairs. There was work to be done. Carpet cleaning, wall patching, deep cleaning, and updating. But for the first time in years, I was excited about taking care of my home because it was truly mine again. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset over Portland and listening to the peaceful sounds of my neighborhood. My phone buzzed with text messages from Jeremy, alternating between anger and manipulation, but I didn't respond. I had said everything that needed to be said. The woman who had spent decades absorbing other people's problems and making their emergencies her responsibilities was gone. In her place was someone who understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that refusal causes pain. Jeremy had been right about one thing. This had indeed been someone's last good year of irresponsible, consequence-free living. He just hadn't realized he was talking about himself. The silence was extraordinary. After months of constant noise, demands, and chaos, my house had returned to the peaceful sanctuary I had originally created. The first week after everyone left, I found myself stopping in doorways just to listen to the quiet, marveling at how different my home felt when it was actually mine again. I spent the initial days assessing and repairing the damage. The basement, apartment where Jeremy had lived, required extensive cleaning and minor renovations. The carpet was stained beyond salvation and had to be replaced entirely. The walls needed patching where furniture had been carelessly moved or where holes had been punched in moments of frustration. The bathroom required professional deep cleaning to remove residue from substances I preferred not to identify. Brooklyn's children had left their mark throughout the house. Crayon marks decorated several walls, sticky fingerprints covered surfaces at child height, and I discovered broken items that had been hidden rather than reported. The backyard needed significant work to repair areas where toys had been left to rust and where the lawn had been damaged by neglect. But instead of feeling overwhelmed by the work ahead, I found myself energized by it. Each repair was an act of reclaiming my space. Each improvement was an investment in my own comfort and happiness, rather than someone else's convenience. I hired contractors for the major work and tackled smaller projects myself, rediscovering the satisfaction of caring for something that was truly mine. My colleagues at work noticed the change immediately. Sarah, my assistant, commented that I seemed lighter, more focused during meetings. Patricia observed that I was smiling more and staying late less often, no longer rushing home to manage household crises that weren't really my responsibility. "You look rested," Patricia said one afternoon as we reviewed quarterly reports. Whatever. You've been doing differently. It's working. I hadn't told anyone at work about the dramatic changes in my living situation. The story felt too personal, too complicated to explain in casual conversation. But the effects were undeniable. Without the constant stress of managing other people's problems and emotions, I was sleeping better, concentrating more effectively, and rediscovering enthusiasm for projects and activities that had been neglected during the chaos. The financial relief was substantial. My grocery bills dropped by 70% almost immediately. Utility costs decreased significantly without 6 adults and 2 children consuming resources. The wear and tear on appliances, furniture, and fixtures stopped accelerating. For the first time in years, I could see my savings account balance growing rather than shrinking, and I began making realistic plans for retirement and travel that had seemed impossible when I was subsidizing an entire household. 3 weeks after Jeremy left, I received my first contact from Seattle. It wasn't from Jeremy himself, but from his uncle Ray, who called on a Tuesday evening with what he clearly intended as a diplomatic intervention. "Linda," Ray began, his tone carefully neutral, "Jeremy's been telling me about the situation down there. I wanted to check in and see how you're doing." I could hear the subtext in his voice. Jeremy had obviously painted himself as the victim of an unreasonable mother who had suddenly become cruel and demanding. Ray was calling to assess the situation and possibly negotiate some kind of reconciliation that would relieve him of the burden of housing Jeremy's entire entourage. "I'm doing very well, Ray," I said honestly. "How are things going up there?" There was a pause before Ray responded, and I could hear the diplomatic wheels turning in his mind. "Well, it's been an adjustment. Jeremy and the others are working on getting back on their feet, but it's taking some time to find jobs and housing in Seattle's market." The translation was clear. Jeremy's group was struggling to find employment and affordable housing, which meant Ray was dealing with the same situation I had been managing for months. The difference was that Ray had a smaller house, less disposable income, and presumably less patience for indefinite freeloading. "That sounds challenging," I said sympathetically. "I'm sure Jeremy appreciates having family support during this transition." Another pause. "Linda, I have to ask. Jeremy says you basically kicked him out with no warning. That doesn't sound like the woman I remember from David's funeral." This was the conversation I had been expecting. Jeremy had crafted a narrative that portrayed my boundaries as sudden, unreasonable, and cruel. In his version, I had transformed overnight from a loving mother into a heartless landlord, kicking out family members without justification or compassion. "Ray," I said carefully, "I gave everyone 30 days' notice and asked for very reasonable contributions and behavior changes. Jeremy chose to leave rather than meet those expectations. I didn't kick anyone out. But these are family members going through difficult times," Ray pressed. "Shouldn't families stick together and help each other through challenges?" It was the same argument Brooklyn had used, the same emotional manipulation that had kept me trapped in an unsustainable situation for years. But I had learned to distinguish between genuine family support and exploitation disguised as family loyalty. Families should absolutely help each other, I agreed. But families should also show mutual respect, contribute what they can, and not take advantage of someone's generosity. What I was dealing with wasn't family support. It was 6 adults and 2 children living in my house rent-free while treating me like hired help. Ray was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly. "Jeremy mentioned something about you wanting money from them. I asked for $300 per month from anyone who wanted to continue living in my house," I clarified. "That's about half the market rate for a room in Portland, and it didn't include utilities or food. It was an extremely reasonable request." Another pause. I could almost hear Ray doing the math, realizing that he was currently providing the same level of support I had been offering, probably without even the minimal financial contribution I had requested. "Well," Ray said finally, "I hope you'll consider reconciling with Jeremy. Family relationships are important." "I agree completely," I said. "That's why I hope Jeremy will learn to value family relationships enough to treat them with respect and reciprocity rather than taking them for granted." The conversation ended cordially but without resolution. Ray had called hoping to facilitate a reconciliation that would solve his own problem, but he had inadvertently confirmed my assessment of the situation. Jeremy was doing exactly what he had done in my house, taking advantage of family generosity while contributing nothing meaningful in return. 2 days later, I received a text message from Jeremy himself. It was the first direct communication since he had left, and it was exactly what I had expected, a mixture of manipulation, self-pity, and veiled threats. "Mom, I hope you're happy. We're struggling up here, and it's all because you couldn't find it in your heart to help family when we needed it most. Ray says we might have to split up and find different places to stay. Is that really what you wanted? For your son to be homeless and separated from the people he cares about?" The message was designed to make me feel guilty and responsible for Jeremy's current difficulties. According to his logic, any problems he faced in Seattle were my fault because I had refused to continue enabling his irresponsible lifestyle. The idea that he might be facing consequences for his own choices and behavior was completely absent from his narrative. I read the message several times before responding. The old version of myself would have immediately called him, offered financial help, maybe even suggested he come back home under the same terms that had been so destructive before. The maternal instinct to fix his problems and make his life easier was still strong. But I had learned to distinguish between helping someone and enabling them. Jeremy wasn't struggling because I had been cruel or unreasonable. He was struggling because he had never learned to take responsibility for his own life, to contribute meaningfully to his relationships, or to treat other people with respect and consideration. My response was brief and clear. "I love you, Jeremy. I hope you find a situation that works well for you. Take care." I didn't offer money, solutions, or an invitation to return. I didn't accept responsibility for his current problems or apologize for setting reasonable boundaries. I simply expressed love without enabling, care without codependency. Jeremy's response came within minutes. "That's it? That's all you have to say to your son who might end up on the street?" The escalation was predictable. When guilt and manipulation didn't work, Jeremy moved to more direct emotional blackmail. The threat of homelessness was designed to trigger my maternal fears and override my rational assessment of the situation. But I knew the threat wasn't realistic. Jeremy had family, friends, and resources available to him. He wasn't actually at risk of sleeping on the street. He was at risk of having to take responsibility for his own life, find employment, contribute to his housing costs, and treat the people helping him with respect and appreciation. Those were normal adult expectations, not cruel punishments. And if Jeremy was unwilling to meet those expectations, then the consequences were his to bear, not mine to prevent. I didn't respond to the second message or to the increasingly desperate and angry messages that followed over the next few days. Jeremy tried every manipulation tactic he had ever used: guilt, self-pity, anger, threats, promises of change, and appeals to maternal love. But I had moved beyond the point where these tactics could control my behavior. I had learned that truly loving someone sometimes means refusing to protect them from the consequences of their choices. I had discovered that enabling destructive behavior isn't kindness, it's cruelty disguised as compassion. A month later, I received an unexpected call from Melissa. She had found work at a coffee shop in Seattle and was living in a studio apartment with 2 roommates. Her voice carried a maturity and confidence that I hadn't heard during the years she lived in my house. "Linda," she said, "I wanted to call. and apologize for how things went. I know we all took advantage of your generosity, and I'm sorry for my part in that. The apology was genuine and specific, acknowledging behavior rather than making excuses or deflecting responsibility. It was the kind of accountability I had hoped for, but never received from Jeremy. "Thank you for saying that, Melissa," I replied. "I appreciate it. How are things going for you up there?" "It's hard," she admitted. "I'm working 2 jobs and living in a tiny space with people I barely know. But it's also good. I'm learning to take care of myself in ways I never had to before. I think I needed this challenge, even though I didn't want it at the time." Melissa's insight was profound. The comfort and security of my house had actually prevented her from developing the independence and self-reliance she needed as an adult. By removing that safety net, I had forced her to discover capabilities she didn't know she possessed. "What about Jeremy and the others?" I asked carefully. Melissa hesitated before answering. "Jeremy's having a harder time adjusting. He's been bouncing between Ray's place and staying with different friends. Marcus went back to Portland last week. Brooklyn and her kids moved in with her ex-husband." The pattern was exactly what I had expected. Without my financial support and endless patience, the group had dispersed to find other sources of assistance. Jeremy was struggling because he had never learned to function independently, while others were adapting and moving forward with their lives. "Ray's getting frustrated," Melissa continued. "Jeremy keeps talking about coming back to Portland, maybe trying to work things out with you. I don't think he understands that the problem wasn't your house or your rules. The problem was how we all treated you." This was the understanding I had hoped Jeremy would develop on his own. The recognition that the issue wasn't my sudden unreasonableness, but rather years of accumulated disrespect and exploitation that had finally reached a breaking point. "Do you think he'll figure that out?" I asked. "I don't know," Melissa said, honestly. "He's still pretty angry, still blaming you for everything that's gone wrong. But maybe with enough time and enough consequences, he'll start to see things differently." The conversation ended with Melissa promising to stay in touch and expressing genuine gratitude for the lessons she was learning through independence. It was the kind of interaction I had hoped to have with Jeremy, honest, respectful, and focused on growth rather than blame. 3 months after the household dispersed, I received a surprise visitor. Patricia knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, carrying flowers and wearing an expression of delighted curiosity. "I had to see this transformation for myself," she announced, stepping into my spotless, peaceful living room. "Linda, this place looks amazing, and you look amazing too." She was right. The house was beautiful again, decorated with care and maintained with pride. More importantly, I felt like myself again. The stress and exhaustion that had become my constant companions were gone, replaced by energy and enthusiasm for life. "It's incredible what you can accomplish when you're not managing everyone else's problems," I said, leading her to the kitchen where I had fresh coffee and pastries ready. We spent the morning catching up, and I found myself sharing details about the situation I had been too embarrassed to discuss before. Patricia listened with a mixture of sympathy and admiration, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief at some of the more outrageous examples of entitlement I described. "I can't believe you put up with that for so long," she said finally. "But I'm so proud of you for finally setting boundaries. It couldn't have been easy." She was right. It hadn't been easy. Every instinct I had developed as a mother had screamed against setting limits on my support for Jeremy. The fear of being seen as mean or selfish had been overwhelming at times. The guilt about potentially damaging our relationship had kept me awake at night. But the alternative had been worse. Continuing to enable Jeremy's irresponsible behavior wouldn't have helped him grow into a capable adult. Allowing the household to continue treating me with disrespect wouldn't have improved any of our relationships. Draining my savings and sacrificing my peace of mind wouldn't have created the gratitude or appreciation I had hoped for. The hardest part, I told Patricia, was realizing that what I thought was love and support was actually preventing Jeremy from learning important life lessons. I thought I was being a good mother by making his life easy, but I was actually setting him up for failure. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their choices. It sounds like Jeremy needed to learn those lessons, even if it was painful for both of you. 6 months later, I received another call from Seattle. This time it was Ray, and his tone was very different from our previous conversation. "Linda," he said, sounding tired and frustrated, "I owe you an apology. I thought you had been too harsh with Jeremy, but now I understand what you were dealing with." Jeremy had apparently worn out his welcome at Ray's house through the same pattern of entitlement and disrespect he had shown in mine. He had contributed nothing financially, helped with no household responsibilities, and gradually brought his problems and drama into Ray's previously peaceful home. "He's moved in with a friend now," Ray continued. "I feel bad about asking him to leave, but I couldn't take it anymore. My wife was getting stressed, our bills were going up, and Jeremy acted like we owed him a place to stay just because we're family." Ray's experience validated everything I had tried to explain during our earlier conversation. The problem wasn't my sudden cruelty or unreasonableness. The problem was Jeremy's inability to function as a respectful, contributing member of any household. "I don't feel good about how things ended," Ray said, "but I have my own family to think about." "You did the right thing," I assured him. Setting boundaries with family is never easy, but sometimes it's necessary. After we hung up, I reflected on how much had changed in the 6 months since I had made my own difficult decision. My house was beautiful and peaceful. My finances were stable. My stress levels were manageable, and my relationship with work and friends had improved dramatically. But most importantly, I had rediscovered my self-respect. The woman who had allowed herself to be treated like a servant in her own home was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth and refused to accept less than she deserved. A year after Jeremy left, I received a letter that surprised me. It was handwritten, several pages long, and came with a Seattle postmark. Jeremy's name was in the return address, but the tone was unlike anything I had received from him before. "Mom," it began, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, and I realize I owe you a real apology. Not just for that stupid comment at your birthday dinner, but for years of taking you for granted and treating you badly." The letter went on to describe Jeremy's struggles in Seattle, his difficulty finding stable employment and housing, and his gradual realization that the problem wasn't with other people's expectations, but with his own behavior and attitude. "I keep running into the same problems everywhere I go," he wrote. "People expect me to contribute, to pull my weight, to show respect and appreciation. I used to think they were all being unreasonable, but now I think maybe I just never learned how to be a good roommate, or friend, or son." The insight was exactly what I had hoped Jeremy would eventually develop. The recognition that his problems weren't caused by other people's cruelty, but by his own failure to meet basic adult responsibilities and social expectations. "I know I hurt you," the letter continued. "I know I embarrassed you and took advantage of your generosity and treated your home like it was my personal hotel. I don't know if you'll ever want to have a relationship with me again, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what you were trying to teach me." The letter concluded with a request that surprised me. "I'm not asking to come back home. I'm not asking for money or help. I just want to know if maybe we could talk sometime. I miss you, Mom, and I want to learn how to be the kind of son who deserves a mother like you." I read the letter several times, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agendas. But the tone was genuinely humble. The insights seemed authentic, and the request was reasonable. Jeremy wasn't asking for anything except the possibility of rebuilding our relationship on healthier terms. I called him that evening. The conversation was tentative at first, both of us uncertain about how to navigate this new dynamic. But gradually, we began to talk honestly about what had gone wrong and what we both wanted moving forward. Jeremy had gotten a job at a warehouse, was sharing an apartment with one roommate who had clear expectations about responsibilities, and was slowly learning to manage his own life without depending on other people to solve his problems. "It's harder than I thought it would be," he admitted. "I never realized how much you were doing for me, or how much I was expecting from you without giving anything back." We talked for over an hour, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was having a conversation with an adult rather than managing a child's emotions and demands. Jeremy asked about my life, expressed genuine interest in my work and hobbies, and even apologized specifically for behaviors I hadn't expected him to remember or acknowledge. "I've been going to some meetings," he said toward the end of our conversation. "Not AA or anything like that, but a support group for people who are learning to be more independent and responsible. It's helping me understand a lot of things about myself that I didn't want to see before." The fact that Jeremy was seeking help and taking responsibility for his own growth was more encouraging than any promise or apology he could have offered. It suggested that his insights were genuine and his commitment to change was real. We agreed to talk regularly and to work slowly toward rebuilding our relationship. There would be no dramatic reconciliation, no immediate return to the way things used to be. Instead, we would create something new, based on mutual respect rather than dependency, on appreciation rather than entitlement. Today, 2 years after Jeremy's cruel birthday toast, my life is unrecognizable from what it was during those chaotic months when my house was full of people who treated me like a convenience rather than a person. I have my peace, my dignity, and my financial security back. More importantly, I have a relationship with my son that is based on genuine affection and respect rather than obligation and manipulation. Jeremy is still in Seattle, still working at the warehouse, still learning to navigate adult responsibilities. But he calls regularly, asks thoughtful questions about my life, and treats our conversations as opportunities for connection rather than requests for assistance. He's even planning to visit for my birthday this year, the first time we'll see each other since he left. I'm looking forward to it, but with realistic expectations and firm boundaries that I'm confident I can maintain. The woman who endured public humiliation rather than confront unacceptable behavior is gone. In her place is someone who understands that real love sometimes requires difficult choices, that enabling destructive behavior isn't kindness, and that the most important relationship you can have is the one with yourself. Jeremy was right about one thing that night at Celestial. It was indeed someone's last good year. He just hadn't realized he was talking about his own last year of consequence-free irresponsibility rather than my declining relevance. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone is the opportunity to grow up, even when they don't want it. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to rescue someone from the lessons they need to learn. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose your own dignity over someone else's comfort, even when that someone is your own child. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.